left corner, I believe. And you also need to stop the video for yourself so we don't see you and we won't record you. So otherwise you'll be on this recording. Okay, I just want to do a quick little explanation of Peace Action New York State. And this is a fundraiser. We're a nonprofit and we're also a political action group. During this time, we can't do our live events that we normally do to raise funds. And we have a lot of important jobs this year, important projects to take care of, particularly Peace Action, the Peace Voter, which is about the elections in November that are so critical right now. And we also are very concerned with keeping our college chapters alive. Let me just tell you, we have 24 college chapters, which is amazing. And in spite of the off-campus, that there's no on-campus life right now, that they're all working virtually from home or somewhere else, our two people that are handling the college chapters, Emily Rubino and Desiree Cepetis, have done an amazing job of keeping them enthusiastic and involved. And they're doing lots of webinars, and we're really pleased with how they're staying involved on all the issues. So we're happy about that. Give you a quick background about us. Peace Action is the largest nation's grassroots peace network with chapters and affiliates throughout the country. At Peace Action, we believe that war is never a suitable response to conflict, and that every person has the right to live without the threat from war, and that America has the resources and the responsibility to both protect and provide for its citizens. Specifically, Peace Action New York State has, we have 12 chapters throughout the state and affiliates, and we have 24 college chapters. And as we are a grassroots organization, our local chapters take a lead in the actions and determining our agenda. So we need your support, and your support has been wonderful on this event. So thank you very much. So now I just want to introduce, you saw, if you got to see the opening film or PowerPoint, you know who our guests are. Our guests are Mick Caouette, the filmmaker of this wonderful documentary that hopefully you've seen. We have Tomlin Coggeshall, who is the grandson of Frances Perkins. We have Blanche Wiesen Cook, renowned author of a lot of Eleanor biography works that are amazing, and some other works that we'll talk about a little later. And we have Alice Kessler Harris, who's a professor at Columbia University. So what we want to start with is we're going to start with Tomlin, who is the grandson of Frances Perkins. And let me give a little introduction about him. And I think he's going to welcome us with a toast to his grandmom. And let me just find his little biography here, sorry. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Well, I know it offhand. Tom is the grandson of Frances Perkins, and he is very active in the Frances Perkins Center, which continues to promote the ideals of Frances Perkins. And that's what I'm looking for right now. I had a little quote, but I think you can tell us right away, Tomlin, what her theory was about the principle about this country and what it should be like.
Right. I certainly can, Sylvia. Thank you. Her quote that you were referring to, I think, is that the government should do everything in its power to give all the people under its jurisdiction the best possible life. And she worked on that in various ways. Yeah, I'd like to start by just thanking Sylvia, Sally, and everyone involved with the Peace Action Network in New York to put all this together, and what a wonderful event it is. And and I'd like to give a toast. My grandmother drank bourbon and branch water. So I don't know if any of you are tuning in with something similar, but here we are together, and it's kind of a two-fisted toast, actually, because I'd like to first toast Mick. Mick has done such a wonderful job in portraying my grandmother's life, her early childhood and up through the mid-1930s, all of the New Deal work. I found the film absolutely gripping and so animating, bringing my grandmother to life for me, which I haven't seen, all the mix work to find the old footage, which really makes you realize that this person lived. So thank you, Mick, for that. It's amazing. And to my grandmother, who inspired Mick to make this film and inspires all of us. At least speaking for myself, I feel inspired to learn from her and carry on the amazing work that she did, and also try to follow in her footsteps in the sort of perseverance that she had in her work. It was amazing how much she got done, and how many people. So she did so much for so many. So cheers to Grandma Frances Perkins.
Cheers.
Cheers. Ah, delicious. So I guess, Sylvia, you'd like me to give a little short talk about my grandmother, right?
Yeah, and I just wanted to now fill in the things that I couldn't find before.
Oh, yeah.
But that you and your husband, Christopher Irvin Rice, have founded the Frances Perkins Center, which is in Newcastle, Maine. And it was the Frances Perkins, it's in the Perkins homestead.
Yes.
That residence known as the Brick House.
Correct.
And it was you started as a nonprofit in 2009, and it's a great place to visit with a lot of information about your wonderful grandmother's legacy.
Right.
And you're dedicated to continue the principle you said, and I have the quote here: government should provide all the people with the best possible life. And you're a very big supporter of the Democratic Committee there in Lincoln County.
Right, local.
Right, so now tell us your story, please. Share with us.
Yeah, the place you mentioned in Maine is pretty wonderful, and it's recently become a nonprofit, the home of a nonprofit called the Frances Perkins Center. I have a little card up here, which is carrying on the legacy of my grandmother and preserving it as well for the public, and hoping to inspire young people to carry on her work. I've been very fortunate to be involved with the beginnings of the center as a founder, but it's by no means only me starting the center. There's a litany of wonderful people who have helped along the way, some still involved, some original founding board members are no longer involved, but it's a great crew to start this nonprofit. And it made me kind of realize that a nonprofit is a difficult thing to start sometimes. And there are many factors. And if you make an analogy to building a small sailboat, it needs a good carpenter crew to assemble the boat, and then you need a good sailing crew to sail the boat, but you really need wind. And that's your cause as a nonprofit, in my analogy. And my grandmother is the wind, of course, and she's provided a wonderful, steady wind. So it certainly was a joint effort to found the Frances Perkins Center, and we're so pleased that it really is doing wonderfully. It's taken off quite well. So I'll give you a little bit of background on my grandmother. Some of you may not have seen Mick's film, but many of you have, I'm sure. So I don't need to go too deep into detail, but I happen to have had a copy of Time magazine with Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the cover right here next to me, and I turned to the page. They listed all of Time's 100 women of the year for quite a few years, I guess 100 years, yeah. And my grandmother is 1933. she's their woman of the year, and they're, I think the pre-film that Sylvia was playing had a picture of Time magazine with my grandmother on the cover. So they had just come into office in 1933, and my grandmother didn't necessarily want to be FDR's Secretary of Labor at that point. She was well established in New York City with my mother, her young teenage daughter going to school there, and her husband, Paul, who had in 1918 had a nervous breakdown, what would today be called bipolar disorder, but they had no idea what it was in those days. So he needed care, and to drop all of that and all the care that she'd been giving them, in the evening. She did work during the day downtown in New York, but she was able to do her work. She had a nice office in New York City. She was able to do her work that was based in Albany, right from New York City most of the time. So it was very difficult. And she decided to, when FDR invited her to be Secretary of Labor in 1933, I think before they were inaugurated, she kind of put the bar high. She didn't want to just go and do it for no particular, didn't get it. She said in the film that Mick put together, she said, I wanted to get something done if I was going to be Secretary of Labor. So she had this list of conditions that she wanted to be agreed upon at the beginning if she was going to be Secretary of Labor. And I think she kind of thought or hoped that the conditions might be a bit too much, and Franklin would say something like, "Oh, Frances, I really don't think we can go do all that," or something. But so she wouldn't have to go. But she made this list on the back of an envelope that really was the essence of the New Deal, and it included healthcare. I mean, universal healthcare was the first item, I think, on the list, but it didn't, of course, that's the one thing they didn't completely accomplish. But old age pension, which became Social Security, 40-hour work week, abolition of child labor, the direct aid to the states. The states were running out of money, sort of like they are right now. And they needed direct aid to begin their assistance programs again. And she said to Franklin, Franklin, you don't want me as your Secretary of Labor if you don't want to work on these things. And he said, well, bully for you, Frances, I won't try to stop you, or something like that. So she had to leave my grandfather and my mother, but she was able to afford some good care, and she did. And they always had time in Maine, in this wonderful house, to escape together as a family. And in a way, the knowing the roots of the family in Maine were brick makers, and they had many boom and bust cycles over the years, which may have inspired my grandmother to put together programs that could buffer all of that. Capitalism was fraught with boom and bust cycles, I think she realized. And so she was very, very dedicated to helping ameliorate all that for people. And she ended up saying in her speech at the 25th anniversary of Social Security in 1960, something referring to Social Security as a solid part of our society, something like, "I am thankful that we will go forward into the future a stronger nation because we have this basic rock of security under all of our people." So that's kind of a lot of little bits and pieces in a nutshell.
Thank you, Tom. Is that it?
Yeah, yeah, I
For
think so.
now, you'll give us some comments later.
Sure.
Sally, I don't know. Sally, I don't know if we can put up the two polls. I forgot we were going to do these two polls, but they relate to some of the things you said, Tomlin.
Yeah.
Can we put that question up? Thank you. And you can answer this and we'll have a very quick result and we can share it with you. Did you get an opportunity to view the documentary prior to this meeting? And also, were you aware of Frances Perkins and her contributions to our country prior to this event? Wow, yeah, it's coming in quickly.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so we'll keep going a little longer here. Obviously a lot of you were aware, 2/3 roughly viewed the documentary, and about 2/3 of you were aware of Frances Perkins, because I hadn't been before I saw Mick's documentary, and I was amazed that I didn't know about her. So this is interesting.
Yeah, that's part of the mission of the Frances Perkins Center, yeah.
Yeah, no, she's an amazing human being, and to not know about her is crazy. She
liked not being in the limelight.
Uh-huh, okay. Well, she did a good job of that, I guess. But it's amazing that, and I'm so happy that so many people knew about her already and got to see the film. But you can still see the film after this, the documentary. And that leads into who our next speaker is. Let me just get rid of this. Stop sharing, okay. Mick is the filmmaker, Mick Caouette is the filmmaker responsible for the acclaimed documentary Summoned, Frances Perkins. Why can't I get rid of this? Oh, I got rid of it, okay, sorry. And his company, Frances Perkins and the General Welfare, his company is South Hill Films. And he was born on the north side of Minneapolis, and even though his films have shown across the country from New York to California, he's still in Minneapolis, in the Minneapolis area. So his nonfiction films he did for Court TV include The Capture and Trial of Adolf Eichmann, The Scottsboro Boys, and his first independent films included The Heart of Bassett Place and Eugene McCarthy, Muses and Mementos. His later productions, independent productions, were Hubert H. Humphrey, The Art of the Possible, and Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall, and the NAACP. They were done in collaboration with WNET 13 in New York and American Public Television. And his latest one is obviously this wonderful film, Summoned, Frances Perkins and the General Welfare. You can find out more about Mick at his website, and we'll share that with you. I think we've already shared it at the beginning, we'll share it at the end, and how you can support his work going forward. So Mick, can we hear from you now?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, thank you. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. The narrator of this film, Victoria Safford, is a family friend, and she's a Unitarian minister here in the Twin Cities. My wife is one of the music directors at her church, and so it's kind of a family affair here. And my wife and daughter are singing Bread and Roses under the final credits. Victoria, this is her first venture into film narration, but she's probably one of the best public speakers I've ever heard. My language is a language of film, of the dance between sound and image. Hers are the words that often fail me. But Victoria is a messenger who brings clarity and power through the spoken word. When the film was premiered here in Minnesota, the first place we showed it, she gave a moving sermon that Sunday, which included some words that are, they're just beyond anything I've ever done as far as public speaking goes. So I'm just gonna quote her sermon, part of it. Right now I'm gonna read it actually. So these are the words of Victoria Safford, the narrator of the film, about Frances. She went to Washington in the depths of the Great Depression and quietly set her hand to a transformational agenda. Unemployment relief, minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, workplace safety, the protection of refugees, immigration reform, the abolition of child labor. And out of thin air, a social security system entirely funded by the people themselves. There's no federal aid program, state program, no social welfare program or policy that exists now, including Medicare, Medicaid, WIC, and SNAP, that cannot trace a direct line to the moral vision, pragmatic brilliance, interior courage, and steadfast faith of Frances Perkins. Her understanding of what our country could and should be was, in her words, a common sense understanding. But it was also radical, revolutionary, and prophetic, and common sense, as common sense so often is. Perkins was doing social work before social work was a thing. She saw firsthand how poverty and despair could crush the dignity out of the bones of a human body. And she saw, or thought she glimpsed, how preventable that was. To ignore suffering and the root causes of suffering was to perpetuate it, to be an accomplice, and to thereby allow something deep inside of you to die in your own being. You love a country by loving its people, by respecting them and yourself too much to normalize brutality. What kind of citizen, what kind of republic do you want to be? David Brooks, in his book, The Road to Character, writes that she was summoned. She was called not to a career or even a cause, but to a vocation. An orientation of the spirit to which she tuned her entire being. She saw what Dorothy Day called the filthy, rotten system. It wasn't just bad policy or bad politics, but evil, sacrilege, resoundingly wrong. Vocation, says Brooks, is not about your heart's desire or the constant pursuit of personal happiness. It is as if your life were an instrument tuned to a larger orchestral intention. And that intention is the city of God, or heaven below, or the peaceable kingdom, or beloved community, or whatever holy name you give it. What music are you moving to? What song will save your life? You are called by the world outside of yourself, by your times, your place, what you have seen and what you know. Called by the broken world and its beauty, and a longing for right order. You are called to a love that will not let go. So those are the words of Victoria Safford. I have one other thing to say, in my own words, that I'd like to share. I wake up every morning, as I think the rest of you do, many of you do, feeling hopeless and helpless and bewildered by what's going on in this world, in this country, and asking myself how it happened. Well, Frances Perkins also faced a crisis during the Depression, her own crisis, and there's hope in her story. When she took office in 1933, many Americans believed that nothing was possible and democracy was dead. Hunger and homelessness was everywhere. The polio epidemic had started. Innocent foreign workers were being jailed and deported. Ballot boxes were stuffed. People were paid to vote multiple times in multiple counties. Dead people were voting. Lynchings and white supremacy were alive and well, with millions of African Americans unable to vote. The government was paralyzed. Recovery plans were labeled socialist, and the president seemed hopelessly out of touch. If that sounds familiar to anyone. But our history suggests that fraud is most effective when elections are close. And in 1932, with the only tool the American people had left, they elected Franklin Roosevelt in numbers that simply overwhelmed any attempts to suppress their vote. So the story of Frances Perkins provides hope that change is possible under the worst of circumstances, and that the disease that now affects our politics can be healed if enough of us demand it. And in the words of Barack Obama, President Obama, one word of advice: vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you. Next, we're going to have Blanche Wiesen Cook, who I think you're familiar with. She's a distinguished professor of history and women's studies at John Jay College and at the Graduate Center at City University of New York. She's also a faculty member of the MA program in biography and memoir. She's the author of the definitive 3-volume biography of America's greatest First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Her book, Crystal Eastman on Women and Revolution, is being re-released right now, so you can look for that too. Blanche, can you speak to us now?
Thank you so much, Sylvia, Mick, Tomlin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm so moved to be here. And Alice and I were going to have a joint toast, but I'll wait for Alice to get on and we can have a joint toast later. Life is about the struggle, and I was very moved by what Mick just said about being hopeless and helpless and, you know, in this hideous moment that we live in. And in this hideous moment, Mick's film and the life of Frances Perkins is so important. And she was a woman of great courage who, as I think it was Tomlin who said, she didn't want a public life. She didn't want to be recognized or seen. She walked alone. But the fact is, she was a great visionary. And after her years at Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, shortly after she graduated from college, where she saw the poverty and the lives of incredibly poor, starving children and families, and went to their homes. And her life then became committed. This is not right. We can do something. There is nothing inevitable about hunger and homelessness and starvation and suffering, and we can end it. And life is about the struggle. And although she was credited with walking alone, the fact is she had a wonderful, I always say never go anywhere without your gang. And Frances Perkins had a wonderful gang, a core of supporters and allies and friends, beginning with the women around Jane Addams' Hull House and Lillian Wald's Henry Street settlement. Her great friend Mary Harriman, who founded the Junior League in 1901 and created the University Settlement House on Rivington Street, where Eleanor Roosevelt was a social worker inspired by Lillian Wald. And these are the women who really worked with Frances Perkins. And it was Molly Dewson and Eleanor Roosevelt who said, we have to have Frances Perkins in a position of power. And they brought Frances Perkins, who worked with Al Smith and who was doing wonderful things in the various New York State commissions that she was powerful in. They brought her to FDR when he was governor in 1928. And that's the beginning of her incredibly important position of power where she could make things done. But it was her vision of what was possible. Her vision that if everybody had education, everybody had work, everybody had health care, there would be an end to suffering and poverty. There might even be peace in the world. And I think Mick's film really makes this so vividly clear. There are some aspects to her vision that are not really emphasized in the film that are so important, that happened later. Her support for immigrants, her refusal to deport innocent people who were union activists. And these are the things that made her very controversial. But today, as we look at the insanity going on, you have the criminalization of refugees and, quote, aliens. And this is not new. It was happening in her day, quote, enemy aliens, and they should all be deported. And it was Frances Perkins who really resisted the worst aspects of this anti-immigrant, anti-refugee reality. And she used the Labor Department to protect immigrants and migrants until by executive order, I think in 1938, FDR simply took it out of the Labor Department, gave it to the Justice Department, and the State Department really ended what Frances Perkins fought so hard for. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's the combination of her commitment to making things better for all people, that both nationally in the United States with what becomes Social Security and internationally is so really fundamental to what we need to reconsider and make part of our own daily effort to make things better so we can survive this creepy moment where people are starving and suffering and are without work and are dying unnecessarily in a way that Frances Perkins would do everything possible to stop.
Thank you so much, Blanche. We'll probably get into those issues with questions that'll come up later from audience. Also, the next speaker is Alice Kessler Harris, who's a professor emerita, I think I'm pronouncing that right, of American history at Columbia University. She's a renowned historian and the president of the Society of American Historians. She's the author of Democracy and the Welfare State. Her other works include In Pursuit of Equity, Women, Men, and the Quest for Economic Citizenship in the 20th Century America. And she also is the author of A Difficult Woman, The Challenging Life and Times of Lillian Hellman. Also, Professor Kessler Harris is a cast member in Mick's film. If you've seen it, you've seen her in there. And if you haven't seen it, you're going to see her in there. Thank you, Alice. Can you give us your thoughts?
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you for the invitation to speak. And thanks, Mick, very much for making the film that I think is so important in bringing Frances Perkins back into public life. So I'm going to play historian a little bit and take off from some of the comments that Blanche and Tomlin and others have made and ask the question of, I put it this way, what accounts for her success? I mean, after all, she enters public office in 1933. She enters federal office in 1933 to take control of a Department of Labor which is at best moribund and which can hardly function because it's so filled with corruption. Its major job being left undone or done only by political influence. She is opposed by labor unions when she enters that job, and the labor unions are then just beginning their dramatic rise of the 1930s. She's also opposed by all the other cabinet members, or virtually all of the other cabinet members, except for two who had already been appointed, because after all, she was the first female member of a presidential cabinet, and that had never happened before. And she wanted something that had not been done in American government or in American life. And the thing that she wanted, that Tomlin captured so effectively, was to ensure that the federal government, not the state governments, which didn't have the money and were of different political persuasions, but that the federal government could and would step in on behalf of ordinary people, of working people when they were in trouble. Capturing that wonderful quote that Tomlin gave us, that the federal government had the responsibility to give all the people the best possibilities. I think I'm mangling that quote, but you get the feeling from it. that was unique in the federal government, and it's that big thing that she really was aiming for. So how does it happen that she succeeded, given all the opposition? And here I want to say that, we might immediately step back and say, well, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, supported her after all. And yes, he gave her a free hand, but he didn't really support her wholeheartedly. He didn't eliminate political hurdles for her. He said, sure, go ahead and do it, but if you fail in doing it, on thy head be it. He wouldn't take any responsibility for the things that she wanted and would initiate, although he would support her larger goals. So how does she succeed? So I have two answers to this question. The first lies in her personality, and I don't want to underestimate this at all. And the second in her political skills, which most historians and most people have in fact underestimated, and which I think were really valuable and in fact provide the explanation for her success. So her personality first, and Tomlin, if I'm saying anything that you think is out of character, please interrupt. She had developed a commitment to working people that had begun when she was at Mount Holyoke College and was first taken on a tour of a factory. She'd never been inside a factory before, that continued through her work in Philadelphia, where she did research for a social research agency that was researching poor people, her move to New York, and then, of course, the witnessing of the Triangle Fire, where 146 people died from a fire which was largely attributed to the negligence of the building's owners. Her commitment never wavered. From these early experiences on, she remained committed to working people, however you define that term. The second is persistence. I have not encountered in my historical studies a man or a woman who is so persistent. She didn't get what she wanted the first time, she tried again the second time, and she didn't get it the second time, she tried the third time. And then if she didn't get it, she compromised so that she could in fact get something out of what she wanted. And she assumed that the next time she tried, she would get the rest of whatever it was that she was looking for. A third is her willingness to adapt, her adaptability. And here I tell the story which Mick actually tells in the movie of a woman who was married and had a child and was a relatively feminine woman who came to Washington and realized that nobody was going to listen to a woman, but they might listen to their mothers. And so if she acted like a mother and dressed like a mother, they might actually pay attention to her. And so she adopted that strategy, and that strategy succeeded in making friends out of enemies, or at least reducing the enmity of some people who opposed her. And finally, I want to say, and this sort of speaks to the issue of limelight, I suppose, that she never sort of took the credit. I don't say never, but she rarely took the credit for what she did. Her major accomplishments were claimed by people like FDR or Robert Wagner or others. And she stepped back and let them take the credit for what she had done, because she knew that that would make it easier the next time to get what she wanted. So, personality. Few of us, I think, would be willing to step back and be both gracious enough and generous enough to let others take the credit for what they had done. And then I want to talk about political skill. And here I pick up off some issues that Blanche raised. I'd say the first real political skill that she has is the ability to work in and create coalitions. In her case, it was coalitions of women who started at Mount Holyoke, moved to her teaching positions in the Midwest, but then actually took shape at Hull House in Chicago, and then at the National Consumers League, where she worked with Florence Kelley, among others, realizing that it was always coalitions of women, groups of women that would help her, we would say networks of women, that would help her to get what she wanted. And also realizing that among these women, she could find common cause. So, for example, Mary Dewson, who Blanche mentioned, she met Mary Dewson and worked with her. She met her through the National Consumers League, and she worked on her through the for the minimum wage acts in both Massachusetts and New York that began around 1912, and then that culminated finally in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And Dewson was a kind of mover behind all of these things. And she was also a mover in the Democratic Party. And as Blanche accurately said, it was Dewson who had Eleanor Roosevelt's ear, who had the president's ear, and who finally moved and made it possible for Perkins to become Secretary of Labor. To become Secretary of Labor, she had to overcome the hostility of trade union leaders who not only didn't want a woman, but wanted a trade unionist to lead that department, and who had lined up one of their own. So when she became Secretary of Labor, when she was appointed Secretary of Labor, there was nothing but grumbling. It was grumbling from everybody in power at least. And she overcame the grumbling, not by arguing with people, not by taking them on, but just by doing her job. She managed to do her job so successfully that she pulled in trade union leadership, which was originally opposed to her. So, for example, unemployment insurance was not something that trade unions wanted. They would have preferred that workers get unemployment insurance through unions, not through the federal government. But it was Frances Perkins who realized that we were never going to get unemployment insurance unless we had the imprimatur of the federal government. And so she she persuaded trade unionists to come along by creating an unemployment insurance program that they could sign onto. And finally, her history of compromise in political skills. And here there are lots of examples, but my favorite one is the health insurance compromise in the Social Security Act itself. Both she and FDR, this was one of the issues that FDR really strongly supported her on, wanted health insurance for everybody. But the American Medical Association had for years been opposed to national health insurance, and many of the congressmen were opposed to a health insurance scheme which was seen as un-American and socialist. And Frances, to her credit, was willing and able to drop the health insurance proposal from the Social Security Act. My heart sinks when I say this, because wouldn't it have been nice if we had had national health insurance at that point? And yet, had she not been willing to do that, we would have neither old age pensions nor would we have unemployment insurance. It was a price that she paid reluctantly, but cleverly. She was willing to pay it in order to get what she wanted. So those two things, her personality, her political skill, they add up to what she would actually have described as direct and vigorous action, which she claimed was necessary to get change, to get permanent change. And that's why I think she succeeded, and it's why I think we should be honoring Frances Perkins. It's a point that Mick Caouette's movie makes eloquently, that she never sat on her hands. She always figured out a way to move, to bypass, to get what she wanted when she needed it. That took not only courage, but it took brains, and it took the capacity to understand where she was and how to work within the environment that she lived in.
Thank you, Professor Kessler Harris. We're going to move into the question and answer segment now. And I saw a couple on the chat. Sally and Desiree, I don't know if you're sort of monitoring that. I do have one that came up prior to the meeting that I wanted to throw out there. But maybe Rudd Platt, maybe you want to ask it yourself. We could unmute you. I know you posed this question about Hull House. Can we find Rudd and unmute him?
Okay, I'm gonna look for Rudd. Hold on.
Rutherford Platt.
I know you're
All
here.
right. Here I am. I'm with
He
you.
unmuted himself. Okay.
Nice to meet you, Sylvia and Sally. What a wonderful program this is. I'm here with my wife, Barbara Kirchner, in Northampton, Massachusetts. And it's a real thrill to hear all of you who have spoken so far, and to congratulate Mick for completing this incredible project. He and I met in Allentown, Pennsylvania, a couple of years ago, and an earlier stage of this film, and it was a long way to go for him. And you've just done a superb job. The question I submitted was a leading question, which I think Blanche Cook has already mentioned in passing, of course, the influence of Hull House and Jane Addams on her milieu of so many important progressives, and in particular, Florence Kelley and Alice Hamilton and Julia Lathrop, and the later residents of Hull House. But in listening to this, I'm still interested in that, because I've become in retirement and an unofficial promoter of Jane Addams, trying to get her back into public attention. But I'm curious about if Frances Perkins had not been who she was and available, would we have Social Security and unemployment and all of the various programs that she is associated with? Would that have happened, much of it or all of it? So that's a new question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Who would like to handle that one?
I can begin, and then perhaps somebody else would like to take over. But I begin, and of course historians are not supposed to be playing the game of what if, what if X, then Y. But what if there had been no Frances Perkins? My own guess is there is unlikely to have been the kind of overall initiative that we finally had. I mean, I'm remembering that in the 1930s, in the federal government, there were already some very talented women. And I'm thinking here of Mary Anderson, who ran the Women's Bureau, which was part of the Department of Labor, or Grace Abbott, who ran the Children's Bureau, and which was also part of the Department of Labor. Both of them very talented. Both of them had been in government service, federal government service, for more than a decade. And yet, neither of them had the imagination or the political skill, or maybe the combination of all of it, to produce the kind of program that Frances Perkins produced. I mean, I'm thinking you know, what kind of enormous courage did it take for this woman to come in? One of the first things she said was when she was made head of the Department of Labor, she said, no, this is the Department for Labor, which was itself a revolutionary statement. I mean, the Department of Labor had been dominated largely by business people and corporations who wanted to control and regulate labor. And now suddenly we had a Department for Labor. And it was that pedestal that gave her the, whatever it was, the chutzpah, I'd say, the imagination to say, no, we have to go further. This has to be a government for labor, for working people, not just a government for corporations. I don't know that anybody else, maybe Blanche, you have a different answer to this, could have been in that position.
Well, there were people around Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed. They had put together committees of activists to fight for the national health care program that the AMA lobbied to death. And there were people around Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed, the American Foundation, very progressive people. So there really are communities of activists. But I have a question for you, Alice, because you deal with it in one of your most splendid books, which is that Frances Perkins, the great visionary and politician, had agreed to many compromises. And the biggest compromise of all was the way the Social Security Act became limited to white industrial factory workers. So that 80% of women were not covered, agricultural workers were not covered, farm workers, domestic workers were not covered, people who we now call, essential workers, the percentage of workers not covered is really extraordinary. And that
95% of African American working women were not covered.
And so Eleanor Roosevelt called it, as did Frances Perkins, a first step. It was a first step, 1935. And you have dealt with, in your work, with where are we now, and when did it change? When did other workers finally get covered?
Well, and some are still not covered, as you know. So when the Social Security Act was first passed, it covered only about 50% of American workers total. And the provisions of the Social Security Act, we always say Frances Perkins, and indeed she got the act through Congress, but the provisions of the Social Security Act, both for unemployment insurance and for what became federal aid to dependent children and for Social Security, were actually developed by technical committees. And those committees were led by people who were mostly suggested by and appointed by Frances Perkins. But Frances Perkins did not, in fact, attend those committee meetings. What happened was that the committees produced reports which then became provisions of the Act. And it was the committees that decided that, for example, they could not cover domestic workers because if employers had to pay a certain percentage, it was then only 1%, and employees had to pay 1%, how could you possibly collect the 1% from domestic workers or agricultural workers? They were too diffuse, they were too temporary, etc. Now that was a euphemism in some ways for the racism that they felt. You know, there was a sense that many of these workers worked in the South. Most of them were Black workers or immigrant workers from Mexico and other Latin American countries. And so we don't actually know what was race and what was, you know, really technical or bureaucratic possibilities.
Politics.
We do know.
Mick, did you want to say something?
Well,
Because
I just want to say
question. Yeah,
I
go
want
ahead.
to say that what you have to keep in mind is that the entire Congress and Senate, mostly the Senate, was controlled by Dixiecrats, major racists, and that was, they were in charge. So if we'd done too much in the bill with too much for African Americans, they would have just, you know, killed the bill.
Exactly right. So when the bill came out of these technical committees, Frances accepted it in order to get it through Congress. Right.
But the way they kept African Americans out of the bill, and without being blatantly racist, was by saying no domestic workers and no farm workers, which was 99% African American.
Right.
They kept them
right.
out. That's all.
Right. But you know, they also kept women out by saying no retail trades workers in the bill.
And no teachers.
No educational employees in the bill. No teachers, no educational employees, no teachers, no nonprofit workers in the bill. 95% of those workers were female. So it's not it's racism, yeah, but it is sexism as well as racism.
Sure.
I'm going to move on to another question. Thank you. I know it's a very complex one, but Sally or Desiree, do we have a question that you have seen on the chat? I saw a question from Bruce Rosen about whether or not Frances Perkins was a protege of Al Smith, and then Elizabeth Morton said he was sort of a protege of hers. So what do you think about that? Does anybody have a strong opinion about her relationship with Al Smith?
I think it went both ways, actually.
Say that again?
I think it went both ways, actually.
Yeah.
I think she, as she often said, she thought much more of him than FDR, and she tried to write his biography at the end of her life, started to.
Wow.
But she loved that guy, and she said, I think he learned from what she was doing, and I think she learned from him. She learned politics from him. He learned about the programs and ideas from her.
Right. And she was very close to Belle Moskowitz.
Yes.
And there really was an alliance right away in the 1920s when she was working for the Industrial Commission, very close.
Because she was close. Because she was close to Al Smith too, as well, right?
Yeah.
Shivaji Sangupta asked a question related to the health insurance issue, and he's saying, it seems to me that Frances Perkins' experience of the Spanish flu must have made her want to see universal health care. Do you think there's any truth in that? Did that have impact on her and her strong feelings about health insurance?
As far as I know, she never talked about the Spanish flu. She did actually talk about New York State had tried to get a statewide universal health insurance program through in 1917. And she had fought hard for that, but it had been killed by trade unions as well as by the medical profession. And then in the 1920s, after women got the vote, of course, women got from Congress we call it the Shepard-Towner Act. That is an act which covered maternal health care, especially in rural areas for women and children. And that was killed by the American Medical Association in 1927, 1928. My own guess is it's not any one thing, but a combination of those things.
She dealt with it in her own life too, by the way, with her husband. You know, she had bills.
But she dropped it, even though her husband would have benefited from it.
Exactly. She had an experience of her own.
Catherine Scope.
Also, it starts with Jane Addams, because folks around Hull House and Alice Hamilton, they fought for a national health care program really in the World War I era before the Spanish flu.
Right.
A quick question from Catherine Skopik. She's asking, were there any other women in the Congress and Senate at this time? When she was the first woman to be the U.S. in the cabinet, but were there women in the Senate and
Uh,
Congress then?
Probably.
the woman from
There were-
Montana, and I can't remember her name now. I've forgotten her name, but I'll think of it in a minute. But there was a woman in
Jeanette
Congress.
Rankin.
Yeah, Rankin, Jeanette Rankin. That's right.
You know, but there was also Mary Norton from
Yes, it was.
For
She
the
was-
Jersey. She was a New Jersey congresswoman, and she actually took over the guidance of the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Yeah, and then a
when
little bit later,
Right.
John Connor-
a little bit later,
There was nobody in the
Margaret
Senate.
J. Smith, too.
well,
But
Margaret
that's
Chase
much later.
Later.
That's much later,
She's
and
the
that's in the
first.
Senate.
Margaret Chase
Yeah.
Smith is later.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
nobody in the Senate.
No,
No.
nobody in the Senate, right.
It's World War II. Margaret Griffiths, Edith Green, those people begin to enter Congress, the House of Congress, during the war.
We're going to
And then
ask,
there's Caroline O'Day, who's very close
Day.
to Frances Perkins, and she's in Congress.
Hmm.
Yeah.
My
All right.
grandmother lived
That's
with her.
very important
you
When is
because
she
when
elected?
Mary Harriman Rumsey dies, Frances Perkins lives with Caroline O'Day, and she's in Congress at the time.
At the time she's in Congress? That's great. So
Yep.
that's part of who she must have relied on.
and someone had a question here for Tomlin. It says, the question, it's from Helen Young. The question is for Tomlin. Do you have any anecdotes to share about your grandmother, which situations where she was a grandma and not Secretary of Labor?
Yeah.
Grandmotherly?
Yeah, in fact, she died, she died when I was 11. So, and she never did get into any of her career with me. It was always grandmother and fun things and, kind of being, enticing my curiosity about things. And I guess I could tell you one story about when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. It was my birthday, and she wanted to take me to FAO Schwartz in New York City, where we lived in the wintertime. So we had a great visit to FAO Schwartz, and I remember leaving with her carrying a couple of shopping bags of whatever we had chosen for my birthday, I guess. And she thought we should go to Grand Central Station. So we took a taxi, and the reason we were going to Grand Central Station turned out to be at the end of a long ramp down to the on the platform. We went all the way to the front of the train, and there was an engineer there who knew her, or at least I'm not sure she knew him, but he definitely knew her. And she said hello and said, "This is my grandson Tomlin. I'd love to have you show him your cab if you have time." And he said, "Certainly." So I remember being lifted up into the cab of this big locomotive in Grand Central Station, and so that was a wonderful experience. And all the while, she had, in those days they didn't have diuretics. She had heart failure, and her ankles were really swollen, and yet she forged ahead to do all these things with me. Just I remember looking back on that, how much love I felt for her in that time.
If you watch the film, you'll hear a line in the film from Chris Bryseth where he says, "And it works for 10-year-old boys too." Well, Tomlin was a 10-year-old boy.
Yeah, that was her description to Chris Bryseth of how she convinced FDR to be clear on what she wanted and what they were going to do. She would have him read it and then repeat it to him, repeat it back to her, and then she would say it, and then he would repeat it back one more time or something to get him to be clear on what the agenda was.
It works for 10-year-old boys too.
Yeah,
Right.
Joe,
was a great
Sal,
that was me.
Sally, are you able to monitor? Have you been able to monitor the questions? Because I haven't done it myself.
We've gotten a lot of questions in the chat, but I think that Kate Alexander, I'm going to unmute you. You had a question, I believe. You were trying to raise your hand.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hi.
I was really struck in the film when she gets into the cabinet and the description of the cabinet, the Department of Labor that she was inheriting as being so corrupt and being really marked by, I mean, what are basically the equivalent to today's ICE raids of targeting immigrant workers. And that strikes a nerve in terms of where we are now and what a next administration might inherit. But it seems like pretty quickly, not only did legislation shift, but like public sentiment shifted from that was what labor was, and now there's a new deal, labor can be so much better, to this real vision. I'm curious what other forces were at work to really change public sentiment around the labor standards, and specifically around the issue of the targeting of migrant workers.
So the big shift actually comes in 1933 with the passage of Section 7A of the NRA, of the National Recovery Act. And Section 7A, if you remember, was advertised as the president wants you to join the union. And that was the moment when everybody, and it was Frances who actually fought for Section 7A. She really believed that workers needed representation on these various boards and commissions that the NRA was putting together. And it was when that happened, I think, that public opinion about Frances began to change, because workers actually flooded into unions. They realized that Frances had actually fought for them, and that she was at the same time speaking out for migrant workers and for the health and safety of working people in general. So I'd say early on, after all NRA is discussed and debated by June of 1933, it didn't take Frances very long to actually make her mark. It took a lot longer to throw people out of the Labor Department and bring in her own people, but she did that very effectively. On the migrant question, Blanche, do you want to say something about that?
Well, it was such a bitter reality as soon as Hitler came to power and refugees were coming in. And Frances Perkins really supported many individuals. I mean, she's responsible for getting Sigmund Freud into the US, the Trapp family, the von Trapp family, credit Frances Perkins specifically. And as this crisis gets bigger and bigger, and FDR is silent and wants no part of this immigration reality, Frances Perkins is more and more isolated, and finally, by executive order in 1938, FDR takes immigration, naturalization away from the Labor Department and goes to the Justice Department, where for the first time, aliens are not only registered, but fingerprinted, something she had been fighting for years. And it's a very bitter reality. It gets more and more bitter. Frances was very loyal. She never protested. She never criticized FDR, although it really did break her heart. And she confided in different friends that this was really not right.
The other reality that was going on during that whole time is that there were no jobs for anybody. So the natural immigration, if someone wanted to come, there's really nothing here for anybody. I mean, during the Depression period. And I think that there were also restrictions.
By 1938, I mean, there was an argument that people were bringing,
later.
People who had come in were bringing jobs. They weren't poor people coming in.
No, right.
So that wasn't quite the case.
No, later on.
Yeah.
We have another question here. Sherry Gorlick has asked quite a few questions. So Sherry, maybe I'll unmute you and you can ask it yourself, okay? Hopefully you're ready. You can unmute yourself or I'll unmute you right now. Are you there, Sherry? Let me make sure. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, okay.
Hi.
So this is wonderful, really, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Hi, Sherry.
Hi, Blanche. Hi, Alice.
Hi, Sherry.
I'm wondering how much of the atmosphere in which Frances was able to maneuver was set by the kinds of activities that of labor protests, the Communist Party. Alice, you said that the trade unions didn't want her to be appointed, but wasn't there a lot of labor unrest, as they say, and a lot of radical activity that makes possible making some of these policies go through?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of double-edged answer to that question. On the one hand, certainly not just labor unrest, but radical unrest in general, left and right. The Communist Party on the one hand, Townsend on the other hand, the right wing was Huey Long and so on, were as active as the left wing. All that made possible, all that made it possible for FDR to say, go ahead and try whatever it was you're doing. On the labor department, on the labor union front, the thing about the labor unions is that they had had a century almost, 3/4 of a century of opposition to government intervention in anything having to do with labor, because the courts and the legislatures had passed one after the other negative acts controlling and regulating labor unions. So labor preferred its own sort of independence. If there was going to be a government labor department, they wanted to control that labor department. They did not want it controlled by a social worker, which is after all what Frances Perkins was, nor did they want it controlled by an ally of either Al Smith or FDR. They wanted their own person in there controlling it. Once she got in and she demonstrated that she was willing to give labor union leaders their head to support Section 7A, to support communist proposals, which she did down the line, from housing owners, the home, what it's called, the homeowners loan program, which loaned poor people money so they could stay in their houses. Once it became clear that she was willing to do those things, then we began to rally behind her. So as I say, it's chicken egg, it's a little bit of both that's going on here.
I wonder if I could add one thing to that, which is that FDR wanted all propaganda, communist propaganda, stopped. And he insists, and he makes a deal when Litvinov comes to visit in 1934, that all communist propaganda will stop. And Frances Perkins is very angry because she said, you don't mention Nazi propaganda. And much more vigorous than communist propaganda is the Nazi propaganda that is absolutely drowning what we now call the media. But Frances Perkins was very clear about that. And I think that's a really interesting reality.
Do you think that's because we were so invested in business in Germany, the US?
Well,
FDR?
yeah. I mean, FDR never called for an end to Nazi propaganda.
Yeah.
He never did. quite astonishing, really.
Yeah.
I have another question from Robert Schaefer that he doesn't have a microphone, so I have to ask it for him. Did Frances Perkins relate in any way to the peace-oriented and international activities of Jane Addams, given Perkins' background with Addams at Hull House?
Good question.
I don't think she was involved with that, but maybe she was.
No, when World War II broke out, Caroline O'Day was very annoyed that Frances Perkins, I mean, she supported the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and she was very eager to bring the ILO out of Europe, which was being just overrun by Hitler, and to save the entire staff, 400 members of the International Labor Organization. But when the war broke out, Frances Perkins really believed the U.S. should get into the war, and Caroline O'Day was very upset. She was a lifelong pacifist. And so there was a bit of a rift between them over World War II, actually.
As there was in much of the country.
Yes. Yes.
I have another question from Alan Galson. Alan, get ready. I'm unmuting you. Hopefully we can find you, and let's see. Are you unmuted? I'm trying to unmute you.
Now I am.
Okay, great.
There he is. Hi.
Hi, I'm asking a question about the relationship between Frances Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt. And as a small point of history, Frances Perkins.
Hello.
Frances, do you hear me?
Yes.
Frances Perkins.
Go ahead.
Frances Perkins in her last years lived in the Telluride House of Cornell, which was a house I belonged to when I was a student at Cornell.
Sorry, I'm still not sure about that.
Sorry about that. We'll try to find out where that sound's coming from. Go ahead, Alan.
I was just
I just wanted to say hello, Alan. I'm Chris Bryceth from Telluride.
Oh, hi, Chris. How are you? We're fellow Telluriders, which is where Mrs. Perkins lived for several years at our Cornell house when she was fairly elderly at that point. But the question I had was, what was her relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and how did Eleanor's take on things influence Perkins, or vice versa?
I think they were allied. Eleanor Roosevelt was very impressed by Frances Perkins' vision and her work and how she got things done and her influence on FDR. I think that Molly Dewson has a little note that said, even though Eleanor Roosevelt was an ally, they were not friends. And she blamed that somehow on Frances Perkins, who, like the Cheshire Cat, walked alone. And I don't really quite understand that, since Eleanor Roosevelt was very close to Mary Harriman Rumsey, and there's a moment when there's something called the Five of Hearts, and it includes Frances Perkins. It's Frances Perkins, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mary Harriman Rumsey, Lady Lindsay, and one other person. And the five of them meet bi-weekly, and this goes on into the middle 30s. So they had a friendship, but it was not a significant, it was not more than an alliance.
Can I add something? Since I'm Chris Bryceth, and
Hi, Chris.
The night before, well, just before Mrs. Roosevelt died, she asked Frances to come to see her at the house on East 65th Street and wanted to talk about her finances. And none of her kids were around. And Miss Perkins came back to the house, and I don't know if Alan, you were there in the living room. She sat in the corner of the table and just recounted this visit, which she thought very sad because Mrs. Roosevelt was alone, except for the what's their name, Blanche, the doctor.
David Gurevich and Edna.
And anyway, I think that was a sign that Mrs. Roosevelt, even at that late stage, looked to Frances for intellectual support. When she died, I called Miss Perkins on the intercom at 7:30 in the morning to see if she'd heard. She said, I've been on the phone for hours. And before I could say anything more, she said, you know, the world is going to talk about how much Mrs. Roosevelt did for the world, but I've known her long enough to know how much she did for herself. And she then went back to when FDR was governor, and Eleanor slept in a little bedroom at the top of the executive mansion. And Frances would be up there with her. And she said Mrs. Roosevelt complained about never having a house of her own and talked about the difficulty with her mother-in-law. And I think there was a part of Frances that kept a view of Eleanor as being a little bit on the self-pitying side. And I think, you know, she was dealing with FDR as one of his policy people. Mrs. Roosevelt was dealing with him as her husband.
Right.
And I think there was a different leverage they each had. They both were terribly important to him. When Mrs. Roosevelt would invite her to her teas for cabinet wives, I think she felt this was a conflictual relationship. Why should she be coming to teas for cabinet wives? So the issue of being a woman and being taken, in effect, as a man in the cabinet, which is part of what she wanted, was involved. Well, she said to me on the phone, I'm glad they're not going to have a big funeral in New York. And she's going to do it the same way that the president did, which was a small funeral in Hyde Park. Well, she came back from Hyde Park, and she said, I never understood how many young people, appreciators, they were lined up on Route 9. All these young people, as the funeral cortege went past, she said, we really should have had the funeral at St. John's the Divine. And I think there was, in that period of just a few days, she renegotiated her picture of Eleanor, and she was terribly fond of her and admired her, talked about her a lot. But I think after that event, she really came closer to the kind of view that Adlai Stevenson and others had of Mrs. Roosevelt. I know, Blanche, if you think that's fair.
No, I do. I think that's really very fair. There's one puzzling moment I think that we all need to spend some time on, which is when Mary Harriman Rumsey died, which broke Frances Perkins. I mean, Frances is so close. Eleanor Roosevelt is with her that whole time and sits next to her during the funeral service, and is just with her, and you know, they're inseparable for that week. So there is a moment, well, it's 1934, it doesn't last forever, but there is a moment when they really were very close,
I
having to do with
I think that kept up.
Mary Harriman Rumsey.
She was,
and how important she was to both of them. And so their friendship in that period.
I just want to, it's 8:27. I don't know how many people can want to hang on and do some more questions, but would you like to do that, or would people like to have our closing toast with Alice and Blanche toasting Frances Perkins?
I'd like to make the closing toast, but I'm willing to.
Shall we do a poll? Shall we do a poll quickly? Sally, can we do that, or is that too hard?
I supposedly can make a poll for you. I'll be back. I'll make it and I'll be back. But in the meantime, maybe we could have a toast.
Yes, let's do the toast if you guys would like to. Are ready?
All right.
Alice and Blanche.
This toast is from Blanche and from me. We thought about what to say together, and we came up with the following, that there is something about the contemporary moment and about Frances Perkins' relevance to the contemporary moment, because this is a moment when so many people have walked away from their responsibility to promote the general welfare. And so many people have discarded the commitment to social justice, which were the essence of Frances Perkins' notions of how to behave and what to accomplish in the New Deal. So we'd like to propose a toast to Frances Perkins for allying herself throughout her life with the many people who felt abandoned in the face of social problems that were not of their own making. A toast to Frances Perkins for allying herself with immigrants, the poor, underpaid workers, and most of all, for recognizing that government has an sustained responsibility to its citizens. Here's to Frances Perkins, who provided hope in a moment of despair.
Wonderful toast.
Yes, thank you. So I had one quick question, but I don't know if we have time for it. I wanted to, I spoke to Tomlin earlier about this. I think it's amazing that Frances Perkins was a main subject of the most recent, of one of the rallies that Elizabeth Warren had at Washington Square, and it was very well attended. And she spoke of Frances Perkins as a woman who had a plan and got it done by working within the government and outside the government with activists. So Tomlin, you had a story about what went on with Elizabeth Warren's campaign and that rally. You want to share it briefly?
Sure, yeah.
Just quickly, it says here that 60% would like to stay on till 9:15. So if other people
I meant to say 8:45.
Okay, 8:45. Sorry.
I thought that was a little bit of a bridge too far. Yeah.
So we'll say 8:45.
Yeah.
It's already 8:30. Okay.
That I can do. I wasn't sure about 9:15.
All right, 8:45. So we'll do that. But if people have to leave, we understand. And thank you so much for joining us. And now, Tomlin, if you could answer or tell us about this. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Well, it boils down to the fact that Elizabeth Warren's chief campaign strategist and his wife came to the Frances Perkins homestead a couple of years ago. And she was pregnant at the time, and they were naming the baby Frances. At that time, they hadn't, he was not yet, this is Joe Rosbars, was not yet the campaign strategist for Elizabeth Warren, but they clearly were very focused on Frances Perkins. And so then time goes by and he does become Elizabeth Warren's campaign strategist. And together they proposed this idea of having an event at the
Washington Square.
Thank you, the Washington Square Park, because it's adjacent to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory building where the fire was in 1911, that my grandmother happened to be nearby having tea when it broke out, and she witnessed it, and it was a very important event in her life on a number of levels. And so they proposed to Elizabeth Warren, let's have a campaign right in Washington Square Park, and give some of your remarks based on Frances Perkins and what she did. So that's how it happened, and she did a beautiful job, and you can find her speech probably on the web, where she wove in something like, Frances Perkins had a plan, And she went forward with her plan she worked from the inside, and people worked from the outside, and together they were able to make real change happen, or something like that.
And you have to tell them the story about the stage.
Stage.
Oh, right. Well, it was actually the podium. They were looking for a podium that would be sort of befitting of the period of the Triangle Fire. And I told them some ideas of where to look. And then they said, no, we decided to make our own podium, a new one. But could we make it out of wood from Frances Perkins' barn in Newcastle, Maine? Where, would you mind if we came up and took some wood from your barn? And I said, no, that'd be great. So we had wood already, some extra piles of extra wood, not really ripping it off the walls of the barn, but some wood in the barn. And they drove up in a big Suburban and loaded it up and headed back to Brooklyn, where a shop where 3 young women created, wooden structures, put together a beautiful podium. And it's
where is that now? Do you know?
I'm sure the campaign has it still.
It would be great for your garden party.
Oh my God, that's right, Mick. Yes, good idea. Thank you.
Sure.
We must.
It's a great idea.
It would be great to have Elizabeth Warren speaking at it, receiving one of our awards.
And bring along the podium.
The garden party is going to be virtual, just so.
Yeah, it is.
This year virtual, which is great. Yeah, it's this, and this event right now is great for us to get a feeling of how these virtual events might go.
There's another question that might be for you, Tomlin.
Yeah.
See if it's from Elizabeth Morton. Are you still with us, Elizabeth? I should have checked first.
I am. I'm right here.
Okay. Do you want to ask it?
Sure. I said, did Frances Perkins have any regrets that haunted her, either personally or professionally?
Oh, that's a good one. I saw that question. Yeah. I think, I'm sure she did. I mean, my mother was a brilliant person and had inherited some of her father's bipolar disorder, so she was a very difficult person to deal with. And one of the things that were distracting for my grandmother had many distractions and sort of demands on her life, I think, that make all of her accomplishments all that much more amazing, that she could get all that done in spite of her husband being kind of down and out for the count, my mother. So perhaps she regretted leaving their care to others, although they were very well cared for. They didn't suffer, I don't think. So that could be one thing. Professional, that would be personal. Professionally, I don't know. Well, she did. I mean, she would have loved to have been the first commissioner of the Social Security Administration, I think. And she always kind of, she made jokes about how it was given to somebody else, but I think she secretly would have loved to have had that. And it was sort of a slap in the face a little bit that she didn't get that opportunity.
Didn't she once say she was a better grandmother than a mother too?
Yeah, that sounds right. I mean, she certainly was wonderful to me.
I mean, I think she had to feel bad about the fact she just didn't have time to be.
Yeah, although I mean, to give her credit.
What she did was amazing.
My mother was a huge handful. I mean.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, there is that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
We've gotten another few sort of questions about the Green New Deal and what people think that Frances would have thought of the Green New Deal if she were alive.
How are you going to pay for it?
I don't think Frances would have thought about how you were going to pay for it. I think she would have thought that that's justice required, that the minimum wage is that.
Yeah.
But it would have been, I mean, she was practical. It would have been.
But she would really believe the Green New Deal was essential right now. What is more necessary to survive? So you'd have full employment, and you'd have occupational safety and health, and you would have an environment that would sustain life rather than destroy life. It's perfect.
And Medicare for all. Don't forget about national health insurance. This would have been her opportunity to get health insurance.
She voted for Bernie. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We call it, at the Frances Perkins Center, we call it the unfinished agenda.
Good.
Yeah. The unfinished agenda is just the healthcare, or?
I think we used that was the one clearly identifiable element that was on the envelope that she brought with her to speak with FDR before she accepted his invitation to be Secretary of Labor. But I think we could add the Green New Deal to the unfinished agenda.
Yes.
I do.
There were a couple of other things that disappointed her. One is that unemployment insurance emerged as a state-based program with federal funding. She really wanted a federal program. She wanted a program that was run either out of the Department of Labor or by some federal agency, because she was aware that states would manipulate and play with and treat unemployment insurance differentially. And that was a bit of a heartbreak. Maybe it doesn't amount to what the health insurance did.
I don't think
thought that might.
Well, that's a good one, Alice. Thank you. Yeah, we should add that.
Yeah.
I think, Chris.
Unfinished.
She was known as the half a loaf girl.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And I think that's part of your theme, Alice, on compromising. But I also think the whole immigration issue, to go to the previous question, would have been a source of, as with Mrs. Roosevelt, who thought failure to find a way to bring the Jews from Europe to America was the greatest failure that she felt. And I think Frances Perkins felt that as well. And to have it taken away from her, just as the thing became really difficult, was very frustrating. That really clipped her wings. And that was followed by the impeachment effort, which all was around Harry Bridges. And
it was actually, the impeachment preceded it.
No, impeachment was 38.
Right. And Immigration was taken away from
her
as a result in part of the Harry Bridges thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Close to the war. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
One thing I think she might have regretted was the way that she talked about it, the way Social Security number became a number for identification and went beyond the Social Security system. She was talking about the census. She didn't like the fact you were identified by your Social Security number.
Yes.
One thing she didn't like.
All the banks, all the insurance companies, all those people. Yeah.
Tell a story about when the census taker came to her house. I love that story.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, my grandmother and I were at the house, and maybe my mother too. It was 1960, so I was 6 years old, and there was a knock on the door at the brick house in Newcastle, Maine, and we went to the door, and it was someone with a clipboard standing outside, and my grandmother said, "Oh, it's the census taker." So we greeted them, and then they began to ask questions. What year was the house built? 1837. How many bedrooms are there? 4. Well, 5 if you count the maid's room. And has electricity been installed? Yes. What year? 1925. And plumbing? What year was plumbing installed? Yes. What year? 1932. Okay. And how many toilets are there? None of your business was the answer. I remember that very well.
Love that story.
I know we're running out of time, but there's a couple of questions that didn't get answered. I don't really know about. One of them is, why did Frances step away from the suffragettes? That was one. And was there ever congressional effort to repeal Social Security like the Affordable Care Act? And I apologize for not bringing on the people, but I know we only have 3 more minutes. So Those are the two questions that I don't
I
think
think
got answered.
I think the Republicans tried, I think, after Social Security was passed, but it was like Obama said, you know, once it becomes a Republican thing, they don't call it Obamacare anymore. So I think once Social Security became embedded, then all of a sudden the Republicans were on board with it. I think a lot of them.
There were numbers of appeals. There were suits against the federal government and appeals about its constitutionality, and they went on for several years.
After, yeah.
So there was a good deal of opposition, but it wasn't, I think as Mick says, it wasn't rooted in Congress. The Republicans in Congress thought it was pretty much a lost cause and didn't come back to it. And so it never really went anywhere.
Yeah. And as you,
and that first question, I don't know that she did walk away from the suffragists.
I don't think so.
I think that's just not the case. Many of her best friends were the leading suffragists.
Yeah. Although, is it true,
and power depended on suffrage.
Yeah. Do you think, though, it's true to say, Blanche, that she sort of, in terms of her career, her focus, she realized that legislation was the way more to get things done rather than standing on a soapbox and trying to convince crowds?
She went in a different direction.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I think that's true.
Also,
many suffragists also went in a different direction. I mean, many of them went towards legislation. Some of them, like Mary Dewson, joined the Democratic Party. Right. Mary Anderson was another. But they'd been good suffragists, and once they won suffrage, they turned their attention to issues of equality, like the National Women's Party, but others towards getting women the benefits or the rights, you know, that men had. So I don't think, I think Blanche is right. She did not walk away from the suffragists. Suffragism changed after suffrage.
Right. Right.
Because there was, with Florence Kelley, who was a central mentor for her, who was head to head with Alice Paul with the ERA because of the women's minimum wage laws, right, in the 20s?
Because of the blanket and protective labor legislation in general.
Did Frances take a side on that? I would assume she would have been on Florence Kelley's side more.
Absolutely.
She was on Florence Kelley's side.
Yeah.
But she always said that she wanted that legislation extended to men, not just for women. But she was on Florence Kelley's side.
Well, it's 8:45.
Thank you. This was great.
Amazing. Wonderful.
This was really great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
To Frances Perkins, to activism.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Shoulder to shoulder into the future.
Can I show you something before we go? I don't know that it'll actually work, but we'll try it here. We have a friend who
Thanks, it was fun.
Hi, Denise. Hi, Martin. Did you have your adult drink?
Yeah, but it's
that's my daughter.
Adult beverage.
The adult drink is seltzer, Mom.
All right.
Bye, Mom.
Hi, Martin.
Bye, Janine.
Great to
Good
hear.
To see you.
Hi, David.
Hi. Bye. Goodbye.
What was Mick going to say?
Showing us.
What's that?
What?
What are you showing?
What was Mick going to say?
Oh, I was just. You have.
Oh, yeah.
Well, first, I wanted to say something to you, Blanche. You know, that when I read your book and you talked about her being by the bedside of Mary, I had no idea. And I actually changed my script at that point because I had something in the script about she had heard third party while she was working that she had died. I had no idea that she was with her. So I changed my script. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
That's one thing. But I wanted to.
Great.
Go ahead.
I want to see if this works. But we have a friend who did my website, she's just great. She's designed my.
Are we together?
She did my website and everything. She has a dog that she dresses up. And the dog's called Eva Knievel.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. We got disconnected for a minute.
We have a friend named Aaron who she has a dog called Eva Knievel, and she dresses up this dog. It's hilarious. So she dressed it up as Frances Barkin.
Oh, I love it.
Oh,
You can
that's
see this or not? Can you see it?
Well, there's a reflection. Can move it up a little bit, Mick? Move it up. Higher up? All right.
Can you put her back on?
Can you see it?
I tell you what, you take a photo of that and send it.
Okay,
And
you can
distribute
pause.
it.
We'll send it to all of the,
it.
yeah, there we go.
I
There we
love
go.
it.
Oh,
I
there we
love
go. That's better. Great.
Beautiful.
That's gonna add on.
We're gonna
The dog,
send out.
the dog just sits there and loves it. So
We're gonna send out a recording, and we'll send that with it, with the
Okay.
recording. If you could send us the photo.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Frances Perkins.
It's lovely. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye, Jerry.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye, Tomlin.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, thanks everyone.
It was
Thank
wonderful.
you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye,
Sylvia,
Catherine.
Allie,
Bye.
Bye.
Everybody.
good night.
Good night. Good night.
Hey,
Good
thanks
night.
again.
Wonderful job tonight.
Bye.
Thank you.
Night all. Sal,
Hey, good night, David.
How do we get out?
you did amazingly well, my darling.
Bye.
Are you coming downstairs?
I will.
Carol, we see Carol.
I await your fairy-like step.
Okay, I'm gonna mute you.
The only
Thank
time you can.
everybody.
The microphone is
George
unmuted.
Candler, come on.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, Alan. It was nice meeting you. Bye, Barbara. Bye, Virginia. Bye, Joanne.
Bye. Bye, Sally.
Bye, Blanche. Love you. Bye, Mary.
Love you, love you.
Bye, Kenny. I'm sorry we didn't get everybody's questions. We
Right.
tried. Bye, Sarah. Bye, Sylvia.
Bye.
Okay, I'm going to end. I'm doing it. Are we-
Bye. Have a good night. And weekend.
All right.
Weekend.
And meeting for all. Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Thank you, Desiree, for your help. Bye.